Let's start over. My name's Eric. I am a staff solutions architect at ChainGuard. We do hardened container images, base images for security, zero CVE images, and they're based on the distroless mantra or a pattern. Just as if I can see everybody, who here doesn't know what a distroless image is? All right, cool. That's about as expected. Who's using them in production? All right, a few of you, that's awesome. So let's get into it. I've only got 30 minutes, so I'm going to hit this as fast as I can. First, we're going to talk about what are they, for those of you who don't know, and why would you want to use them. Now, because we only have 30 minutes, we're really not going to get into how to build an image on top of them. If you want to learn more about that kind of a thing, make an open session for it, and I'll make sure I attend and we can talk all about it. Let's say you are a Node programmer, Node.js, JavaScripter. And if you're another language, just insert that logo on the middle of that container. You want to put your app in a container. You're going to go out probably to Docker Hub or some other image repository and pull down the official Node image. Now, there are many of them out there. What you're expecting to end up is to have a container with Node, and then you're going to put your app on top of it, right? Well, those of you who have done any of this work, you're going to know you're going to get a lot more. You're going to get an entire Debian distribution, container-sized, and probably curl. You're going to have bash in there, obviously. You might have Vim in there. wget might be. All these other tools are going to be in there. What you wanted was that, but you got this. Now, why is that a problem? It's not a problem, but from a security standpoint, it is challenging, because now, if there are any vulnerabilities in all of those other bits that are in that image, they're in your deployment. They're in your end container. If there's any vulnerabilities in your code, heaven forbid, or in the libraries you're pulling in, and I can exploit one of those, and so let's say I get an RCE, a remote code execution, I can use any of those tools now to expand my exploit across. So let's look at some numbers to kind of get a feel for what I'm talking about here. The Node image, this is as of this past weekend. Node 22.9, built on Debian 12 Bookworm, is about the general image, the one you would use for exploratory development or maybe in your build stage of a multi-stage Docker file, is about 1.6 gigabyte. And there's 618 Debian packages in that image. Now, they have a slim version, which if you're not using for production and you want to continue to use the official images, you should be using the slim one at least, because that drops you down to 333 megabyte, 292 packages. And the important thing there is to look at what vulnerabilities are coming just in your base image. That general image has 586 vulnerabilities. 10 of them are critical and 115 are high. You do not want to deploy to production with that much, and you don't want to try to mitigate all of those. Now, if you're on the slim one, it does drop you down to 1 critical, 1 high. Again, these are as of Saturday using the Gripe open source scanner. So that's a lot easier to mitigate, a lot easier to handle. But when we get into what a distroless image is, you're going to see some vast difference here. A distroless image is like that prior slide. It is an image with basically just Node and what's needed to run it, or Python, or Java, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And if we look at the Google distroless project images for Node, same version, their Node code is Debian-based. They get the packages from Debian, but they put it on top of, and they use another tool to build everything so that they don't have the rest of the distribution in there. Your size drops to, depending on if you're looking at the latest one or their debug tag, which is the one that has a shell in it, you're looking at about 210 to 212 megabyte. Your packages, your Debian packages, are 10 and 9. Your vulns drop to, on the production image, 14. So, and there's still one critical, which is interesting. I hadn't looked at what that one is. It's probably a Node.js vulnerability itself, so as soon as that project updates, hopefully they'll fix that. But that's the kind of difference you're looking at. You're coming to the table with a much slimmer image and a much smaller attack surface for your container when it gets into production. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a lot easier to start from as long as you can get your app onto it. Now, I will mention the ChainGuard images. We have a free set of images out there, and we are based on an open source project called Wolfie, which is a distro that's not meant for running like a VM or anything. It's a container distro. We're very similar mantra. In fact, one of our founders, our CTO, Matt Moore, created distroless at Google before he founded my company. And so we're kind of an evolution of distroless. And if you look at our version of Node, our general version, what we call our dev version, That one is almost a gigabyte. Packages counts, you can't really take apples to apples because we use APK, and APK does things more granularly, at least we do. So we have a lot of small packages. You see there's 319 or 270, the latest version being the one that has no extra bits on it. It's just node what you need to run your node app. But more critically, we have zero CVEs. We do that because we're constantly rebuilding all the projects from source that are in there and releasing multiple times a day. Now you might say, well, what about Alpine? I mentioned APKs. Even though Wolfie and ChainGuard is based on that, we're not Alpine. But Alpine is a good distro. So Alpine, the distro, actually predates Docker, or right around the same time, but it isn't, most people think about it as a small image for Docker. They're actually just a small OS. They're very tiny, a lot of embedded space. I believe they're just basically BusyBox with a package manager and a few things on top of it. But if you look at their version of Node, it also is only about 213 megabyte and has, again, 220 Alpine packages on it. And it, at the moment I scanned this, had zero CVE. Now, Alpine is not a hardened, they don't advertise themselves as a hardened image, but because they do build very, very rapidly, they often can get down to zero CVE. Now again, it's important to note, these are from Saturday. If the same image was scanned today, it might be different because CVEs are found all the time. The main reason, now you might ask, well, why would I go distroless? And there are some challenges to going distroless because you have no package manager to install things, whatever. But why wouldn't I just go Alpine? You could, you totally could. Alpine though is different than all these other images and most other Linux distributions in that it's built on musl, or some people call it musl, instead of glibc. So if you've got a binary of any kind in your application that was compiled like an SO file or some other executable that you've got stuffed in a jar somewhere and you're going to do a JNI call from Java to it, or any other kind of binary, it needs to be recompiled for musl or Alpine. Or else you can't run it on top of that. You'll get a seg fault. So all that being said, you can see that the main images are big for a reason. They have a lot of extra stuff in them. Distroless images are small because they don't, but that brings up challenges. If I've got an application running on a distroless type image, and I need to inspect it. I need to troubleshoot something on it. How do I do that? So let's get into that, and we're going to get out of the slides and go to a shell. I know that's probably too small to read. I just wanted to show I've got an image running locally on my machine. It's Prometheus, and I'll grow the font up a bit, make it wrap and be ugly. But let's say, for example, so this is a Prometheus image from our Wolfie ChainGuard free tier. It is a distroless type image that we've put Prometheus on there for you. I just used Prometheus as an example I pulled out of the hat. But let's say I'm a developer and I want to see why Prometheus is acting a certain way with the feeds coming from my application. So I've started up a container of it. Now I want to take a look at the YAML file that configures Prometheus. So I'm going to exec into that container to do that. Well, actually, before I do that, let's make sure it's up and running. So refresh this page. Let's see if something happens here. So I got a good query back. So I know that this is a localhost hit. So this is my Prometheus, and it's good and running. So just to show you, this is an actual live demo. So let's exec in. Let's take a look at that Prometheus YAML. So I'm going to do a docker exec into the Prometheus container running bash. Oh, I can't because there's no bash. OK, well, let's try running just sh. Well, that's not there either. Do I have to give it the full path? No, because none of those are in it because it's a distroless container. Well, let's do this. Let's just start up the container and we'll cat out that YAML file so I can see what the default YAML from the image I'm running is. So I'm going to do a docker run, change the entry point to bin cat. There's the image name and then the file I want to cat out. There's no cat. There's literally nothing in that bin directory in a distroless image most of the time, unless the platform you're deploying just happened to have to need something there. So what am I going to do? Well, the first tool I'm going to show you is Docker debug. Now, disclaimer, even though I'm a Docker captain, I'm not a shill for Docker. This tool requires a paid tier version of Docker Desktop. If you don't have that, just hold on. We'll talk about other things. But if you do, and a lot of companies of size do license Docker Desktop, so I want to show it, you can run Docker debug and the name of your container. I'm going to run that. And this is cached, so it's running nice and fast. This built out a sidecar container kind of pattern. They used Nix to build out this big multi-layer thing. Attached it to the namespaces and whatnot and proc file systems and everything of the target container. So it's now, I can do a PS, and there's my Prometheus process running as PID1 as the non-root user. And it has mounted its file system in, so I can actually get in there, and there's the Prometheus YAML file. So Docker debug lets me do this on a distroless image, even when there's no shell in there, because it's a sidecar that has the shell, and it's done all the kind of the fancy work of getting that set up for me. So let's say, I have no idea, I'm not a Prometheus expert, I have no idea if that will do anything, but I'm going to change that scrape interval to 25 seconds. Changed it, let's cat it to make sure it's stuck. Prometheus, and there it is. So that's Docker debug. That's pretty cool. But I can hear you saying, I don't pay for Docker Desktop. We don't have a pro tier or business tier. We're not licensed for it. So what else can I do? Well, if you still sticking with the Docker Desktop tooling, there is another tier that, thing that's available in the free tier. If you go to the console of that. So I'm looking at my containers running on my machine, and there's that Prometheus one. Grow this up. You can see if I open that, there's my logs. It has an exec, but of course I can't do that. But they have a file view. It's a nice little browser of all the files in that running container. And in fact, there's bin, and there it is. It's empty. But if I look at Etsy, Prometheus, YAML, and I click this little file editor, you get a little VS Code window. There it is. There's the change I had made to it prior, and I'm like, oh, really, I meant to make it 20, whatever. Save that. So that's another tool that's available if you're on a Docker Desktop machine. It's in the free tier, at least for now. Use it. I love that they added this. It's pretty nice, and you can look at all the other files in there and whatnot. Okay, that's fine and dandy. You say, I'm not on Docker Desktop. We're not allowed to use it because of the licenses, or we are on a Linux workstation, and I don't have a desktop. I'm just a shell into it. So what do I do then? Well, there's another tool called cdebug, C for container. It's an open source tool that I have really started to fall in love with, and you can run it very similar to a Docker exec. So I'm going to do a cdebug exec, interactive TTY. The --rm means remove. It's going to do the same thing Docker debug does. It's going to start up a kind of a side debugging container, and that's just saying remove it when I'm done. I'm going to point it at Prometheus. Now, the first time I run this, I get a permission failure. We'll talk about what this means in a second in detail, but what it's trying to do at a high level is when it's trying to map that file system into my debug container, kind of chroot type of a thing, and it can't, and we'll talk about why in a minute. But because I'm running locally, I would never tell you to run a container privileged, unless you're like developing monitoring tools or something. But locally, YOLO, go for it. cdebug exposes a privilege tag to where I can run as a privileged mode, and I can do that mount. Now, just like in Docker debug, there's my processes, and Prometheus, there's the same file system with the change. There's that 20 I changed in the UI before. We'll make this back to, I don't know, 21, whatever. So that's pretty cool. The next thing you might say is, well, I'm not running locally. I have a Kubernetes cluster. I have a developer cluster over here that I'm trying to figure out why it's acting a certain way. And again, remember, this is just an example. Think of any other application that you would need to do this kind of thing to. Tomcat, Nginx, whatever. But in this case, it's the same thing. So you see here a pod definition. Is that visible? Can you make it out? Okay. We're going to deploy a pod named demo pod with a container in it that's running the Prometheus image we ran before. And mount a data path we need for it. So we're going to deploy that right now. Everything's cached, so it's nice and fast. Now, of course, kubectl exec is not going to work, the same reason Docker exec didn't work, because I don't have a shell. Luckily, the Kubernetes folks, I don't remember if it was a year or two ago, they added kubectl debug. And if you've not used this, this is pretty cool. This uses ephemeral container features in later versions of Kubernetes to stand up the same kind of a setup. It's going to, in the pod, stand up another container alongside the ones that are running and do the magic mounting stuff that you need to see into it, or at least the process mounting. And here I'm saying debug into the demo pod, the container named demo pod, because I'm not very creative and I just use the same name, and use a busybox image as my default debugging image. So it's going to do that, starting up that side container, and I'm in. Sure enough, there's my PID1. You can see it's running as user 65532, which is what that runs as. And now, the etc directory in here is not mounted because of the way this works. It can't do that automatically, or it doesn't do it automatically. So that's really the busybox etc directory. So to get into it, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to go into the proc file system, into PID1. So if you're familiar with Linux, proc file system has got all your processes and whatnot and other things. PID1 is where it's running, and inside of there is a sudo directory called root, which is the root file system as presented to PID1. So I cd into that. Oh, I can't. Why is that? This gets back to why we saw a failure in cdebug earlier. So I'm root. I'm overloading the word root here. So I am UID 0. I am the elevated privileged user. You'd think I could do anything, but in this case, that root named quasi file is owned by 65532, which is what PID1 is running as. And because of the way the namespaces in Linux work and other things that are beyond the scope of this discussion, I can't get in there as anyone other than 65532. Now, I don't have sudo, I don't have I'm not going to go through all this, but I can't su into that user, I can't do that. So how do I get in there and actually see that file? Well, let's go back out and run this a different way. There's no way to tell kubectl debug, hey, run my debug container as a user, or run it in privileged mode. That's just not an option with kubectl debug. But I could just make another image that has that default user at the same UID and use that image. In fact, since I'm using a chain guard image that had Prometheus in it, we have a dev version of that image, the fatter general one, that has exactly that. So I'm just going to use that so I don't have to make my own image. So I'm going to run the demo pod again. And instead of busybox, I'm going to use that Prometheus image. And now you can see I'm the right user. I can still, same thing, I can see my processes. But now if I go to proc1 root, I'm in. And I can then ls, cd into the etc directory under that, into Prometheus YAML, and there I am. Now, of course, this is back to the defaults because we're in a new deployment from before. But you'll notice at the bottom of the screen it says this is a read-only mode. So here's the catch-22 of this situation. If I do an ls, like any good deployment, like any well-run secure image, configuration files that need to stay static are owned by root and world readable, and the process is not root, because you don't want to be root in your container. Because if somebody gets in there as you don't want them to be the elevated privilege. So I can't edit this. So I can view it. So if I just wanted to see it, that's fine. But I want to edit this. I want to get in there and change things. So let's jump back out of here. Let's go back to our friend cdebug. I don't mean to sound like a shill for this project, but I really like it because it also supports remote Kubernetes pods. You can feed the syntax, same syntax, exec, IT, put the word pod / and then the name of the pod and the name of the container you're targeting, and it will try to do the same thing. We got the same error we got before, did that on purpose, but it has a user argument. So I can say, okay, connect to that pod and that container in that pod as user 65532. It's going to create, I think it uses busybox as well as a default, but it's going to create a user in that debug container, and I'm in the same state I was in a second ago. I'm that user, but I am now able to get into things. But I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I'm running low on time. I still can't edit the file because I'm not root, because I can't be root because it's kind of a catch-22. So let's get out of here. Well, cdebug also still supports privileged in a Kubernetes context. So now I'm in there. Do my PS to make sure I am. Yep, I'm in there. And it has done the whole mounting thing because I'm root. Do an ID to show you. So you can see I'm root, etc Prometheus. Come on. vi Prometheus YAML. And now since I'm root, I can do whatever I want. Ta-da, so there we go. There. So with 3 or 4 minutes left, let's talk about what we just saw. And I'm going to leave this up here while I talk, so if you want to snap that, that QR code will take you to a GitHub repository of mine that I just started that has these slides, that has all of the stuff you're seeing here linked, and it has the demo I just ran, so you can run it yourself if you want. That is active lines of code that we're running. It wasn't a video, even though I wasn't having to type. So the things I mentioned here, we talked about Google distroless images, that project. That's a link to the GitHub repository for them. They have many images. They have Node, Python, Java, and others. I talked about Docker debug. So if you are interested, if you are a licensed Docker user and want to use that tool, that's the link to go see that. You could also, from there, go look at Docker Desktop if you don't already have it, if you care to use it. cdebug, I've got that open right here. That link will take you here to this GitHub page that talks about it. Ivan, the author of this, is amazing. This is just a great tool, and I hope that, as you can see, they're looking at adding other things like Podman, OCI, and they're adding other features for different runtimes. I didn't mention this while I was talking, but there's a tool called Dive I also like to use. Dive, if you've not used it, another open source project that allows you to dive into an image file system, and it shows you a kind of a file browser view for every layer in an image, or the aggregated set of them, and see what directory changes are happening at each layer. It doesn't show you the contents of files, but it does show you what's being moved around in an image between each layer. It's a cool tool. And then I used Gripe for scanning, so I linked it there if you wanted to use that for the demo. You're going to need that. Now, there's some links at the bottom. I mentioned earlier Matt Moore, our CTO, created distroless at Google. He's done a couple of a blog. The first one is a blog that he did on our site about kind of the history of getting towards declarative builds. We don't do builds with Docker files, neither does Google distroless. They use Bazel. We use a tool called APKO. We do builds that are reproducible. So in secure supply chain, one of the tenets, or if you go look at your Salsa levels, one of the things you want to be able to do is build the same thing twice and get exactly the same digest out of it, right? Well, using tools like what he talks about in that blog, you can get to that. He also did a podcast about a month or two ago where he goes into the history of distroless images. I found it pretty interesting. I'm a nerd, but yay. And he also talks a bit about how it evolved into what we did here at ChainGuard. And the last two are a couple of small videos that my fellow Docker captain and colleague Adrian Moat did on similar things to what I showed you, but a little bit different angle on it, editing different apps. But they're nice bite-sized videos that you can share around with your friends and whatever. So with that, I am out of time. Like I said, I did not get into how to use a distroless image to add your app to it. If you're interested in that, like I said, put something on the open sessions. I'd be happy to go in and we could talk about that. Also, I was given the approval. We are hiring, so if you know containers and you can be put in front of a customer and talk to them, my info is at the top of that board over there. Go look at that career site. We'd love to have you talk to us. With that, I am basically out of time. If you have questions, I'll be around. Hit me up. Thank you very much.